for the ego and the other. So I put a comment here, which is this question: what is the subject of the discourse? And this was the question that marked the point at which we left off
Yeah.
during our last discussion.
Yeah.
And we're going to start to unfold.
Okay.
The meaning of that is. So we're still talking about resistance and transference. And Lacan is working to disentangle the meaning of resistance from the definitions that characterize ego psychology. The example that he cited during the last chapter was that of Margaret Little and her take on countertransference and its role in the analytic process. And we should point out that the example in question here was not something that Margaret Little had experienced in her analytic practice directly, but she was referring to an analyst she knew.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, that's what makes a lot more sense, because I thought like it was like Margaret Little was the one in question, but then reading the PDF that you sent of the specific case, it's like it was a male analyst, and it was somebody, yeah, like that she was acquainted with, that she was writing about.
Right. So Lacan was coming at that from the point of view of her, I guess, what he felt was her misinterpretation of the place of
And
interpretation in that case, which she was criticizing how the analyst had used a specific interpretation at an ill-timed moment, but Lacan feels like her critique of that technique was also
yeah. And even though like I was under the assumption that it was a female analyst, or it was Margaret Little that was conducting the case, like what I was saying still could apply in the fact that like, because it maybe the that person, the radio broadcaster, didn't really have too much of a relationship with their father, or like whether or not that was brought up or not. But the fact that the mother in that case, she passed away, and she could even be, and this is the question, it's like, because it has to deal with Oedipus complex, like how does the Oedipus apply to a single mother, of a child, or kids or whatever? Well, like it could apply in the fact that the paternal metaphor, which is that's what the Oedipus is, it's the intervention through the paternal metaphor, that the mother, even though that she gives the satisfaction and the immediate care towards this individual, this child, and the upbringing, can also display the categorical imperative, or the prohibition, the no, like don't do this. Mommy is gonna go hang out with her friends. Mommy's gonna do this. Mommy's gonna have her own time away from you. That could act as the paternal metaphor. So in the sense, he's still Oedipalized while still maintaining and wanting the satisfaction from his mother. And so that transference went on to that male analyst. Because in the end, it's still a neurotic transference, because Oedipal complex is at the root, if I'm not mistaken, of neurotic transference.
right. And I think the reason Lacan wanted to cite this article in particular is because he feels like we can't get a good grasp of the meaning of transference if we haven't already defined countertransference, which I guess he would agree with Margaret Little that maybe countertransference itself isn't uh, often given the attention.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's like something that is really only definable when it like, I guess what she said, in its function. And the fact you never really know that there's countertransference until it's functioning. And these are like remnants of the analysts repressed things, if there's still repression. And I think that's like the whole significance of analysts still going through their own analytic sessions as well with another analyst. They become the analyst, and it's kind of like and it's kind of funny too, because it's like it shows you that this is what also makes psychoanalytic the analyst discourse not a master's discourse. That the analyst can be subject to and their own analysis. It's also just like how in the beginning Lacan references a Zen Buddhist koan, or makes a comparison of the student and the teacher with the Zen Buddhists and their koans, which make the Zen student search for their answers, or the Zen monk will give them an answer, but it's only just to stimulate their further investigation. And then like within this, it's like they find out later that the Zen monk never really had the answers. The answers were all in them. The answer that they gave him during that time was just something that would satisfy their craving or their demands for some type of recognition, just to assert their dominance. Like, oh yeah, there's Zen master, grandmaster for a reason. But they're also actually praying to other masters in their ancestry and lineage as well. Like, they're not this be all enlightenment. Like, they're actually selfless towards other, ancestral lineage and so on and so on. But no, the point is the fact is I think that's kind of cool to put it in that analogy, because that's what like the analyst is,
Right.
Or that the analyst is supposed to be.
I'm reminded of what we were talking about earlier. We were talking about Socrates and Plato, and I know in dialogues, I think it might be the Theaetetus, Socrates says that the philosopher should be the midwife of truth, like to facilitate the process of birth, but in the role of like a kind of a surrogate, or a third party, and that when you have a one-to-one correspondence, you're always going to be limited to the imaginary plane, the imaginary dimension, and he's going to get back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, like you're saying, it sort of goes back to this sort of, I guess there are different variations on this adage that, you already know the answer to the question that you pose in some sense.
Yeah.
So
you just haven't formulated it.
like, I think a lot of people would agree with that kind of pearl of common wisdom sort of thinking, but it's like, okay, fair enough, but what really is the process that allows that to happen? It gets tricky.
And that's kind of funny, because it's like, was it you that mentioned according to like Lacan's demeanor, he was like simplistic as possible? Like, was it you that had a conversation?
From what I've heard,
yeah,
in this interview I heard with, he was a former priest who became an analysand.
Yeah, he went to a Catholic university.
And I guess he was a lapsed Catholic, and he was really having a sort of existential crisis. And he described Lacan as being a person of the utmost simplicity, which is the exact opposite of everything you would mean from these seminars. This is the most complicated, most abstruse sort of person you could ever imagine.
That's kind of funny. I think that, and like, now that we're mentioning this, like, I think it's kind of interesting, the relationship between Catholicism, or Lacan's Catholicism, and psychoanalysis, because like this is something that is like mainly in Catholics, and you see it in the movies too. But the act of confession, and it's like they're confessing all their fantasies to the priest, and the priest is just there listening, but they're not the ones making the judgments or anything. They're the ones that are just they're the blank screen, but it's really God who's listening. That's the third other, the symbolic order. They only listen through by latching onto the symbolic. So it's like, does the the analysts, according to Lacan, have that. Not to say that like Lacan's thing is imbued with Catholicism. This is what what's his name, Don uh, Carveth, the dude whose link I sent you to on understanding transference. He
The
believes
ten
there's
minute
this innate
one.
Catholicism in Lacan, especially with his lectures on In the Names of the Father, whereas with Freud, even though Freud tried to disavow his own religious tradition, that there was still this innate Judaism in it because of the patriarchal prohibiting father. But even though Freud hated all religion, like that sentiment was in there, and that's what he was looking for. I don't know how I feel about that, but I just thought it was interesting, like how you put that out. But I do find that there is this interesting kind of correlation between understanding how the process of confession works in Catholicism and the act of kind of confessing your fantasies and just talking about it, free associating it. But it's like you're not trying to be forgiven by saying a whole like these Hail Marys by the names of the Father. You're actually trying to work through what does the Father want, or what does the desire of the other want, and like getting, I guess, not letting the master signifier affect you.
That's an interesting parallel, and I'd imagine that there are some grains of the psychoanalytic process in the act of confessing, especially like in the context of something that's so symbolically charged to begin with. You know, the
Yeah.
issue that's a lot of analysts are going to face, as they mention in, I forget which essay it was from the commentary, but one of the issues is actually an ignorance on the part of the analyst of the analysand's symbolic universe, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this will come up later, but for Lacan, his apparently very, because he's a very erudite man, like his knowledge of uh, Islamic law actually helped in the case of, I won't describe it now, but actually, just as like a little foreshadowing later, but his knowledge of that law actually came into play in being able to bring out his analysand's subjective, unconscious attachments to certain aspects of that law. But we should just leave it at there, lest we go off on a Jacquian tangent of our own, which are always fun, but it's all about the text. So, all right, we're back to resistance. Now, this chapter is filled with moments of like etymology and translation, and we've got some German, we've got some French. I don't know if you have any comments on any of that stuff, or
Yeah, I know that like Verdrunk is supposed to be the word for repression, and then like I don't know too much about the other stuff. Like it probably behoove of me to look up the etymology of these German terms besides Verdrunk or Verdrungen, which is supposed to be repression, and it even says on like the how like there's like the list of headings of like what's to be discussed in the or this like lecture, but
right.
like how it says Verwerfung is not the same as Verdrängung. Verwerfung being like refusal or rejection, and then like Verdrängung or Verdränk is repressed or the mechanisms of repression. But like I guess from what it says like on that one, étouffé or whatever, I think that is French. It's like something being stifled, something being stuck and feeble. But like it's like what, like are they really the same thing, or what's the difference between the two? And I think maybe it's not only just the etymological thing, but also the fact that they're getting at these terms because of the translation between not only like Freud's text, but like through Strachey, but also how it was transmitted in that process into France as well. Because Strachey was the primary translator of Freud's works, but a lot of stuff probably got mistranslated as well, as like especially the difference between like instinct and drive, especially like death drive be calling like death instinct. That's like the one I know off the top of my head. Like the confusion between drive and instinct was because of Strachey.
So
I mean, I'm not sure about like how this entails, but I noticed like there's a lot of stuff where they kind of bring more clarification in the seminar because of the fact that it's translated from its original form into French, so it has a weird like connotation, or the fact that it's just mistranslated in general, so we have to use our French to kind of use the metaphor to understand it.
right. So clarification of terms is also one of the things that's prompting Lacan's return to Freud.
Yeah, clarification definitely, and in especially, I mean, yeah, all the text in general, all of the seminar, but like how he's just so meticulous about understanding the process of resistance, or like the phenomenon of transference and the process of resistance taking place within transference, its relationship too, because like he talks about that. And even in this one particular is like Freud, and we'll get to that, but I just want to say like this is a perfect example. Freud could have used transference phenomenon, but he didn't. He just said transference in this case.
Right. So at certain points, he's clarifying Freudian terminology, and at other points, he's adding to it, maybe even bringing out what might be latent within the ideas.
Yes.
So at this point, he's reading an essay and he's going through it more or less line by line. This part I found a little bit confusing, and I don't know if he was bringing this up to demonstrate where there are certain like lacunae between the texts in German and French, and just to show you that like that some of this has been butchered, or if there's a specific point that he's trying to make with this line here. For when all is said and done, is impossible to destroy anyone in absentia or in effigy. And then he says in the German text we find, because one should recall that no one can be killed in absentia,
yeah,
in effigy, and those are two very different statements.
yeah, and like I'm wondering if it's just the fact that like, is it the fact that like it's not that something is being destroyed because it's nothing, but at the same time like it is, this might be something like or absent or not there at all, but it makes me think of preluding to what is later his less than nothing, which is more Zizek, but still it's like talking about the objet, that which is like it's not that it doesn't exist or it exists, but it's not even nothing, but it's a less than nothing. And this could be like just the overall the symptom, the fantasies, the fantasy of the ego is the fantasy. It's a misrecognition, but it's not to say that it's neither, it's dialectic on the fact that it's neither here nor there, or but the fact that it functions. Like there is no like little man in here, but at the same time there's this like false sense of agency that this ego has, and like you can't just destroy it.
It functions so long as speech.
Yeah, and that's why like I'm thinking like is that what he is getting at too? Because like there's sometimes where like I get lost with the certain language that's being used by Lacan, like when he's being like witty, or he's making these weird remarks or statements or playing with words or language, and or his overall sense of humor. Like he's being provocative, because he's definitely known for being provocative. And like also like it also depends if he's acting like this because of his audience, like because he can. Like, and that's also the overall cultural mood at that time that like we may be alien to.
Right, because these are people like a very high level of cultural refinement, and
Yeah.
wants to also maybe keep them entertained.
Yeah.
That's a little bit, but I see here he says there's some peculiar inaccuracies which go right to the limit of impropriety, and this is just one peculiar inaccuracy, but maybe he has some other intention in bringing this up. I'm not exactly sure, but he says isolated the phrase cannot be understood, whereas in Freud's text is perfectly articulated. So maybe in a sense, it's also a kind of injunction to return to the letter of what Freud is saying, which of course we know is his whole project right now.
Yeah. It was the whole project is Return to Floyd.
So we're back to the pathogenic nucleus here, and this idea that resistance is met with approximation, which in the footnote here, he says, I guess this is Muller's footnote, sense of approximation Lacan is using here is close to that used in mathematics. Archimedes, a method that recursively approximates to its desired end by repeated application of a rule.
And it seems like it's almost getting towards like when he wants to get towards like death drive, especially like when he talks about repeated rules, a repeated function, a repeated or not function, a repeated sort of maybe like like a discourse, the repetition of the various symptom or like the satisfaction of the symptom, this enjoyment of it. Of course, like he hasn't brought anything up. Like death drive doesn't come in until seminar 2, but still it only comes in the form of the symbolic. I think like this is just overall working in of that, where he's like alluding to all these things that we already know, but like in this stage it's being foreshadowed. He hasn't gone up to that. Like we already know like the bigger picture of what Lacan's talking about and all these terms, jouissance, death drive, but like this is like seeing it kind of build up to that, especially like he's known for his math theme, so it's like he's using like he's giving us a little chaser of what he's trying to work with, using like the mathematical terms like radial or whatever axis.
Right, and it seems like there's a sort of dialectic at play.
Yeah, he's a developmental thinker, which makes him great. It's like there's no actual, like even though like Seminar 11 is like his popular work, or like 20 when he talks about like feminine jouissance and all that sexual difference. Like the point is like, look, there's no actual way you could like put a focal point to Lacan. Like this is his magnum opus. Like he's just an overall developmental thinker. So he's like working out everything in here, and then it's just like it's a trajectory from there. And I think it's like right here he's using these like specific mathematical concepts or structural linguistics to propel himself while latching on to, and this is what I like to focus on, is like with the beginning of the text, it's transference and resistance. And mainly because this is what allows the analyst to do their technique in the first place. If there's no transference, if there's no resistance, at least this is what's commonly understood by Freud. Of course, like what's great about Lacan is that he actually focused more on the psychotics because he was a psychiatrist. So he wants to apply the Freudian method to all other areas that weren't covered. But in this case, we're working with the neuroses in this complex and in the nucleus of the symptom, in the resistances. Let's take them as like, okay, we're given a neurotic subject. This is where we're propelled out to do our technique because we get the transference and then we're getting a resistance back.
And you made me think of how if a lot of what he plays around with vis-a-vis math themes, and also just different forms of discourse in general, makes me wonder if it isn't in some ways an exemplification of the very thing that he's talking about here, which is this sort of like blending of discourses. And his work is the way he expresses himself involves a lot of different, seemingly heterogeneous forms of discourse, which of course he gets a lot of criticism for that because people say, oh, he abuses mathematics, he misuses mathematics, he misuses certain concepts. He sometimes appears to be just toying with disciplines which, again, none of us can verify the degree to which he was actually um, learned in one branch of science or mathematics or another. But it's like, to me, almost trying to illustrate the very nature of discourse by mixing discourse, breaking things. I mean, he's speaking now, so it's only natural that he might break off in the middle of a sentence and mess around with syntax, but that's a part of the technique.
Yeah, definitely. Especially for him, like, because it's language.
Especially for Lacan, yeah. So talking about the pathogenic complex here, and we talked about this a little bit in that we should maybe not read complex as Oedipal, or maybe it's a little too premature to bring up that.
Well, I think this is the one where he brings up Jung into it, if I'm not mistaken, and Oedipus is brought up. But we should take this, since, like, if we're talking about an erotic subject in the transference, especially since, like, we're being, at least so far, we're being strict reading to Freud, and all his patients were neurotics, obsessional hysterics, but still neurotics in essence. Then it would be the Oedipal transference, the Oedipal complex that was being transferred. Because it's Freud never had any, like, somebody, like, as far as psychotics, like schizophrenics, etc. Like, that's all. Like, the closest was his trying to analyze the memoirs of Schreber, but it wasn't like he was actually, in the office, like, like Schreber was on the couch or anything, because he believed that psychotics just weren't able to do analysis because they couldn't transfer.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So transference is Oedipally configured.
Well, no, because you have psychotic transference. There's just something that you could see. I wouldn't say Lacan
Because the
did
has
this.
been processed through the
Yeah.
complex in a sense.
Yes. So, like, as far as we're saying, like, it's like within the transference, um, whatever the complex is and the bundles of affects, emotions, and if it's a neurotic patient, which, they will, most likely be Oedipalized, a lot that will symbolically transfer onto the analyst, because that's what the analyst will work through. The analyst will be able to use their technique through this transference by interpreting and analyzing the patient's speech, especially if there's always this clinging on to, like, a certain, like, fixation or focal point of language that kind of refers back to, like, a name of the father, or some type of thing that will defer to Oedipalization, and in the name of the father is obviously just paternal metaphor. It doesn't have to be a specific, like, literal father figure. It's just like there's the whatever is taking place in the imaginary is the Oedipal complex, but, like, what is the symbolic function of that name of the father?
Right. But what I was saying before is that the paternal function, paternal metaphor isn't able to function in the universe of the psychotic.
Yeah, because it's like it's foreclosing. It's like the unconscious, and I think you were saying this, like, before our chat, or before, like, this stream is it was during our chat that the psychotic is, like, pretty much it's like in an imaginary relationship with itself. Like, the unconscious is, yeah, it's cut off, so it's just like a purely ego imaginary relationship with the real, and, like, it confuses, it's aggressivity of this absolute other with reality itself. So there's just like kind of like this back and forth, like either just free floating or aggressiveness with, you know, the radicality of the real. It's just like there's no signification, there's no like some symbolic other that structures it. Like it's like literally in its own discourse.
Right.
Yeah.
Aggressivity with an absolute other.
Yeah. It confuses the absolute other, but like it's not like the big other, like the big other is masterly signifying it in discourse. It's like what it sees as the radical other or absolute other is like pretty much this aspect of the mirroring, the imaginary, because that's what the imaginary does. It's always like it's a perception, it's a gestalt, but it's not like it's identifying with like its own image. It could be like aggressive towards its own mirror image, like you see it, like the psychotic can see themselves in the mirror, but it's like this. It could be this radical, like resistance where it's like it sees this as a separate other, kind of like a dog when it sees its reflection in the mirror. Sometimes it might bark at itself like it's another dog.
Yeah.
Like something like, yeah, along lines like that. There's no like able to like identify with that, like see itself as like is like a mirror. Like there's no that primary narcissism or whatever Lacan will talk about later.
Right. And secondary narcissism, in a sense, is going to say.
Well, the secondary is part of like the paternal metaphor in the sense that there is the symbolic, yeah, alienation.
So let's look at this quote here. And I feel like he's said this already in a few different ways, but he says the manifestation in the conscience, right down to its roots in the unconscious, we reach a region where the resistant makes itself felt so clearly that the association which then emerges bears its mark and appears to us as a compromise between the requirements of this resistance and that of the work of investigation. That those are Freud's words.
Yeah.
And then I'll skip to this part here. Similar experiences teach us that the transference idea is arrived at in preference to all other possible associations capable of sliding into consciousness precisely because it satisfies the resistance, the requirements of this resistance.
Yeah.
And we're going to see some examples of this a bit later on.
I think that's kind of interesting too, because it's like there's a satisfaction in the resistance, and like it maintains that, at least what we saw in Margaret Little, like there was the resistance, and what it did was not only satisfy it, but it also brought some coherency and unification in the ego, because of like how that patient was disoriented. That satisfaction of just like hearing the analyst's like affirmation in their words was obviously resisting the further investigation of the full speech or the subject or the subject at question, pretty much, if I'm using that term correctly, the unconscious. And by latching onto that counter transference was this like satisfaction toward that was received by the analysand's resistance, and its satisfaction of pretty much maintaining unification or this false sense of mastery. And I think it's also kind of interesting too on this sentence how, so later on you'll see transference phenomenon, but right here there's like transference hyphen idea rather than transference hyphen phenomena, or even then later you'll have transference hyphen love. Like I didn't really put that into perspective, but like what do you think that could possibly mean?
So it's in preference to all other possible associations. So it's going to be one of many associations that has a privileged position here of being the strongest sort of um, representative of resistance, or the strongest link in the resistance, I would think, almost.
Yeah. Or like, oh, now that I'm thinking about it, like it's literally just like not even like trying to nuke it, like just to think simply like an idea that the analyst had in the transference, like, oh, like he kind of got silent when he was talking about like this time, like, you know, he had like a fantasy about something. Let's say like he had a fantasy like about like, I don't know, like his teacher or something like that, and like the analyst wrote that down and kind of smirked. It's like he got something like, does he feel that I'm kind of perverse because I, like, you know, had this like wishful thinking about my teacher or something like that? Like that could be the idea. Like, I don't know, just throwing something out there, like something like commonsensical.
That makes sense. I mean, because he's going to say
Yeah.
something about silence here. He says when the patient is silent, there is every chance
Yeah.
that this drying up of his discourse is due to some thought relating to the analyst. So that would be the transference idea.
Yeah. And I think maybe like in like where it becomes like more like this might be like, because again, like I still gotta be able to differentiate between the difference of transference neuroses and neurotic transference. But I think this is what's building up towards the fact of what we're getting into, the fact that the presence of the analyst, and the fact that it's not only its presence, but it's like, oh shit, I feel like the analyst has an opinion of their own, and then it becomes neurotic in the sense it's like it symbolically or it metaphorically takes on like the prohibition or like the structure of the superego.
But it's almost like, so you were attributing to the analyst in that moment a kind of a level of judgment, or like a judging sort of agency
Yeah.
in a sense that only reflects on your own probably unconscious value system in a sense.
Yes. Yes. Because that's what's being transferred on. And it's not like so like much it's deeply unconscious, but the fact it could be like at the superficial level. If we're talking about Freudian terms, the preconscious, you know, at some level where like you could maybe reorient it with hypnosis or something like that, but it's not deep enough to where it's like, oh, you actually did not remember that until we just were at this level of our analysis. It's been like 2 years in and we finally coming up with this. It's like, no, it's like these values and stuff, these could come in like within like a couple months, like depending on how the frequency of analysis is, like if they're doing like an hour a day or like, you know, maybe like 3 or 4 sessions out of the week and it's about an hour.
Yeah, and
Months.
but to bring it back to the silence of the patient, I was telling you earlier how I talked to a psychodynamic psychoanalyst, is what he calls himself, and that what he's doing, his technique probably isn't exactly abiding by these principles, but I've had this question posed to me before. Doubtless
Yeah.
you're a thought that relates to me. But to take it back to Margaret Little, when I asked him why he was asked that question, because it's not all the time that he's asking that question, he said, oh, well, it's a transference question. So that's also something that's pivotal here, is whether or not to introduce the notion of transference to the patient. And that's something that Margaret Little was like exploring in her article.
Yeah.
After I
Well, I
read it.
think, yeah. And it's also the fact it's like the analyst speaking, the times the analyst should speak and what they should respond with, or listening to like within the analyst's silence or questions, like what is the underlying demand? Like it's like I don't think he references here, but it's like there's like a certain like I think it's an American linguistics text, like how to use words or how to play with words. It's like there's an implicit meaning into like what is being said or asked. It's like, for an example, and I take the one dude's channel I really like, the was it Singularity as Sublimity, because he mentions it. I think it's in this chapter or in the next, I think the next one or two, but like, like when you're at the dinner table and you want the salt and pepper to season your food, but it's not right there, and then you're looking over the table and you're like, oh, there's the salt and pepper. You're not trying to indicate a fact. What you're trying to do is relay a message. It's like, hey, there's a salt, pepper, implying like we're waiting for the response. Oh, I'll hand it to you, whatever, like dad, bro, whatever, like whatever family member it is. But like, you're waiting for that implicit response, like as if the other person is aware of what you're trying to imply. Like, in a sense, that's what's being implied in the analysan's demand, of like whatever, in the case of Margaret Little, of what's being implied in that demand or in that kind of like question of like, are you jealous of my success, or were you thinking about like, my success in this, that, and the third of the broadcast, the radio broadcast. I think that's something also that has to tie into the transference, is like, how are these statements or questions being said? Like, is it really that like, simple, cut and dry, or is there something within the analysan's emotional register?
So in the case of like asking for the salt, there's an implicit message that's meant to be picked up on.
Yeah, it's not like, hey, can you hand me the salt? It's like you're looking for the salt, you're doing like this, and you're like, oh, there's the salt, there's the pepper. Like, you're obviously making gestures that you were looking for, and then you're like, oh, there it is. But like, you're also implying like, oh, can somebody hand it to me because it's all the way over there? But you didn't say that.
But then working out from something as basic as that, there are like higher orders of implicit messaging.
Yeah.
But of course, it gets incredibly ambiguous, and it gets to the point where, well, of course, that person isn't necessarily going to have the in their mind, but in that moment, you experience the other person as judging you, as or approving of your behavior, or loving you, or hating you, or whatever.
Yeah, because that's part of the transference and the resistance, because like whatever symbolic material being transferred onto the analyst, it's like they're not taking on that role, but they're working through the symbolic roles and these metaphors of the father, paternal function, the paternal function, the maternal object, etc. Like these objects of satisfaction in this dialogue. So it's like they're getting like this analysans like kind of niches of like how they communicate, how they express themselves in all that. And like, yeah, like it becomes more obscure and nuanced, but it's a higher order.
Right. And it's later he's going to say the unconscious emerges in the deformations. We're looking for silences here. We're looking for the drying up of discourse. We're looking for when the discourse is suddenly, like right at the verge of something revelatory, it unhooks from that discourse and goes right back to empty speech.
Yes.
That can be a source of frustration for the analyst, who would then counter transfer quite possibly.
Yeah. And that could be like, because it's like they're too hesitant about like trying to, again, you're just saying, it's like in the beginning about being too persistent of trying to unlock the unconscious. Like, if there's something to unlock, it's like, no, it's right there. Listen to the speech. Don't get too excited. Didn't he say that like in a couple of like
one of the, I think it's Z, could be Zizek.
Don't get too excited.
But he's gotta take the analyst like by the shoulders and like shake them and say, "You idiot, you cretin! Like, how are you not getting this?"
And the transference happening just because, or the counter transference happening because they got too excited. They're like, oh, now I'm about to end this whole man's career right here and there, and it's like, no, you ended your own career, homie. But like, no, for real though, like in all seriousness, no, it's like because of that kind of gesture, it's like they're waiting for something to be unlocked, like that there was something there that they were looking for. It's like, no, it's all in the mechanisms that are formulating all this discourse. You just have to pay attention again. The deformations will happen because the ego is mediated speech. So,
It's
and I think this is,
it's like rather than coming out with some juicy sort of like nugget of truth that's like, oh, this
yeah,
entire time I've been thinking that you're my mother and you're not my mother. It's not like that. It's
yeah,
like rather that you shouldn't be frustrated with the silence or the fact that they aren't coming up with a purely like revelatory expression in that moment, but rather it's like you just hit on the locus of resistance in that silence. And
yeah,
that's what we're focused on. We're looking for the silences. We're looking for the
yes.
breaks.
Because then the resistances will come up. It's like he's dialectical in that sense. It's like, the truth comes out in error. That meme, it's like the truth is structured like cap.
That should be the name of
Shit is stupid. But yeah, like it's like you're looking for those. That's what he says, like even in function and field, that these errors or this deformation of speech, because the empty speech is bound to deform and fail, but like it's the split between the, again, like the ego and the unconscious, but that like as the ego keeps speaking and it's bound to fail and deform through these slips of the tongues, through these silences, through the forgetting of names, that unlocks the doors for these particular truth phenomenons, lack of a better term, I'll just say that, like within revealing certain parts of the unconscious. Like not like this kernel of truth, like this algama or like this objet but the fact that something is being said, something is revelatory, that isn't the ego mediating, that it's we're getting a little bit of the subject.
But would you say that empty speech shouldn't be dispensed with either? Like the analyst shouldn't necessarily discourage explicit
Yeah,
speech because empty speech will eventually give way through these deformations.
exactly. Yeah. And obviously, so long as like if you're always just talking like empty speech, you just be like talking about like somebody else, like you're not just talking about your own life, what you did today, and just free associating with the fact like that you just keep going on and on and on, and like the analysts will get bored. Like there comes a point in empty speech where maybe it doesn't fail, but it's not like really keeping the analyst engaged, because it's like at some point it just becomes a masturbatory exercise for the analysand to vent. It just becomes venting and even a narcissistic exercise, because they're just inflating themselves of what they did. But it's when like certain things fail, like, or they, oh, I didn't mean to say this, or like, I don't know why I'm telling you this about my mother, like you don't need to know about this. Oh, really? Why is that? Like, well, what about your mother? Like, and then they go on and on, or like, well, you kind of know like how, how like some people will, they'll vent with you, and this is just like, kind of like nonchalant example, but like some people will vent with you about like an incident that happened either like with a family member, like of like a kind of conflictual situation, or like maybe it's like not even with the family member but a boss or something, just anybody. There's a conflict situation, they're just trying to have you understand their perspective, but at the end, instead of them kind of quilting like a solution, they're just like, well, I don't know. They'll just say, I don't know anyways. But it's like, well, what about that I don't know? Like there's that, like that I don't know is obviously you're saying something, but then I don't know kind of indicates that there's a silence or kind of like a disavow of a conflict that is like hesitant about being engaged. Obviously, there's a conflict between you and that person, but what is kind of keeping enjoyment of it, of disengaging from the conflict by saying, I don't know. I may be kind of like
No, that was
on that, but you know,
uh,
that could be an example in somebody in an analysis saying like, maybe bringing up a conflict or something with, them in a relationship, and they say, I don't know a bunch. Well, what is it that you don't know? Like, take that, like, don't take that for granted, especially if they're fixated on, and again, we're using speech, we're using language. So it's like, if they keep circling around that, like if their whole point is like, they're constantly in conflict and in disputes, but yet it's never resolved. They just kind of disengage with other people. But like when they talk about it, they just say, I don't know. Like, at the end of the day, I don't know. I'm just living my life.
Right.
Yeah.
It, I like when you said at the end of the day, because it's at the end of the day sort of statements. I feel like that often press.
Yeah.
But
And it could be empty speech, but it's like if that's constantly your whole like narrative, it's like, okay, so what is this? What can I draw and like, create like a quilting point, like, or what's the underlying element?
how can I bring out the absences in this
Yeah.
breaks in discourse? How can I make that obvious to you? To and that hence like the efficacy of the short session, it in that
Mhm.
the effort is to bring out the not the determinate meaning behind silences, but just the fact of the silences themselves should, I think, contour a different space that the analyst is previously unaware of. And that space would be the beyond of the ego, of course.
Yeah.
And it has to do with what's going on here, I think. It's that, he calls this an infinitely pure phenomenon. And when they don't immediately deflect, then a much more vital realization can occur, which Zen might say, I'm aware all of a sudden of the fact of your presence. And he talks about presence here, and it
Yeah.
sounds, or he calls it mysterious, and I think it's a really fascinating point here. And this can create anxiety. It can create,
Yeah. And that comes with the fact that, oh, the enjoyment of just, again, this, I think it's, I like to use this term, it's literally masturbatory exercise of just venting or getting caught in your own narcissistic way of just communicating, just lashing out. Because even like when again, we mentioned this earlier back, like does one really need analysis when one could vent to their friends or to their family members or someone close to them? It's like at some point, like, you can't associate about your fantasies, your fixations. You just can't free associate at all in that sense. But you're speaking your mind, you're venting, and you just expect that person to just be like, okay, yeah, 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 or like give you feedback in ways that kind of approve you, like, and like boost you up. In a sense, the analyst is not doing that. The analyst is quiet, but there's this isolation of this person's like inflation of their ego because they just keep communicating about their life without hesitation, without interruption. But then it becomes a point, it's like, wait, I'm not getting the feedback I want. Or maybe like they realize, oh, they haven't said a word. Oh shit, you're there, but who is this there? Like, because in this speech, this discourse, it's the I and you. But because, and let's just say, like, because, like, if you go into analysis, you're supposed to be duped to at some point to believe that the analyst is like subject supposed to know that they have the answers to all your problems. But you kind of maybe forgot about that, or that was put in the back of your mind just because you're getting lost associating talking about your day or talking about like any other things that like going deeper in your life in this empty speech. Then and this is the point when you realize that there's a presence there. That's the presence and the transference at the same time. That's when a resistance comes up, because it's like, oh, this transference, like this subject's supposed to know, is also maybe somebody could kind of judge me or prohibit me from enjoying. I feel like my enjoyment was caught up. I'm put in this aggressivity of I'm below them. Bars.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Ours. So the essence of the imaginary relation really is set in relief in those moments through the lack of reciprocation.
Yeah, and we got to think about it like old school, like analysis. Like, and I think this is like where Freud wanted, like, the analyst needs to be like a blank slate. Like the person walks in, and it's not like you actually greet, like, when you walk in a room, you're like, hey, how are you doing? Like, like you're like in a normal day, whether it's you go to work, you go to school, or like, you come home and you have roommates or you have family, you greet each other. in this formal setting, you come in and you just lie down. You don't even really greet the analyst in that same way. Like there's this weird connection, and you just sit down. And I think this is like the criticism of like other forms of psychotherapy compared to analysis, because it's like, no, there needs to be this dynamic connection and process with, this, and this is the whole point of ego psychology, things like that. But if you really think about the way our culture is structured, and the way in late stage capitalism, the ego is so much gratified and commodified, and where people are getting their own symptom, their own jouissance, and getting all these types of comfort. And even in therapy, in mindfulness culture, it's just like, focus on you, deep breathing within, like with these mindfulness apps and meditation apps, these deep breathing exercises, like understanding your automatic thoughts and behaviors. It's like, know about you, the focus is on you, like, and it's just like having you imagine yourself like on a beach or on the top of a mountain, like all these things that reify the fantasy structure of the ego. But in this not allowed to enjoy, like, and not saying that every analyst is like this, because my Jungian analyst is not like this, where like, I walk in and I immediately lie down on the couch. But it's the fact that Freud had people lie down on the couch immediately, not looking at him directly, but just like kind of like looking up like at the ceiling as they're talking, like lying down in like some comfortable way, and just kind of associating and talking and talking. But it's like the fact, it's like, oh wait, I look up and the analyst is right there. Now that's when the transference begins. The transference didn't start when they signed up, but although it can, is the fact that the transfers can start when they sign up for analysis, because I think that happened with the Wolf Man or the Rat Man, one of those two with Freud. Is like they were trying to trick him and like lie to him, because they wanted to see how they would interpret, or how Freud would interpret him, because like he read one of his essays prior to receiving analysis from him.
That is also going to be a part of the example that he uses, analogous situation with
Yeah.
a patient a little bit later on.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And I like this idea of passing from one slope of the discourse to another. And I like this idea of slope, because it seems like something you could slip down or fall off, that you suddenly, in a sense, lose your bearings. And what comes to your rescue, I imagine, would be whatever that transference idea that lies close to the barrier of the pathogenic nucleus. And then the idea doesn't need to be articulated, but it's there, right? It's there in some kind of like phantasmatic or even phantom-like form, and it remains to be discovered. And it's never one thing. Again, to go back to, I don't know his name, but the name of the channel that you referenced before, the Singularity and Sublimity, but he also talks about thought and motion, right? That's one of his playlists. It's like it's something in motion, whatever it is.
And the other guy that I sent you his lecture is the boomer analyst, Donald Charveth, or whatever his last name is. Like when he's talking about like just like this is where the technique starts, is like, and I think like it is really useful, because he does reference a lot of Lacan, and I feel like what Lacan is doing right here is kind of like he's finding that dialectical, not opposite, like reconciliation, but just like where the trajectory is between object relation and Freudian analysis from Freud himself, not from somebody like Anna Freud or anybody like that. So pretty much it's like the real contradiction comes between the Kleinian and the Freudian method. But the fact that it's like one talks about repression and the unconscious, the other one talks about, and then narcissism, but the other one talks about like object relations and the fantasy and the traversing of that, and fetishisms that really take place in that. And I think that what he's trying to do is really just show like ultimately that there still is this form of narcissism in that it becomes like an object for itself. Um, and this is the point, is that they also, maybe not them in particular, but just the fact that, again, analysis gets this wrong because they take the ego for granted, or they take it as this thing that needs to be healed or coped with, and only seeing two bodies and not seeing like the third.
But would you say also the notion that resistance needs to be overcome, that it is
Yeah.
inimical, you know, that
Which,
there needs to be some countervailing force to quell the resistance, to get
yeah.
past resistance. And, you know, it seems like Lacan saying you're not seeing the forest for the trees here.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing, is because that's where the technique lies.
He says
Because
to create these access routes to truth, the form of the resistance takes determines the access road to the subject, and someone like whoever Z is, well, we can find that out later, but
yeah,
their frustration, their countertransference with
yeah,
idiotic analysis is not productive, because it's like you have it, it's right there.
yeah. And that's the thing. It's like that's where part of the technique is, like seeing the resistance is not being a cop, like what he was saying in like the Margaret Little chapter. We're not being detectives or cops and like trying to stop these resistances. Like it's like, no, we're gonna see these manifold and see the path where it'll take us. That's part of our technique in the transference, is locating the resistances and going towards that location, not trying to overcome it, not trying to appease it, too, in the way of like, like, oh, were you mad at me, like, don't worry, like I could assure you, and like catering to the patient, because then you're undermining the treatment.
Right. It's like you want this is a really stupid analogy, but it just popped in my head. It's like you want your child to eat more broccoli, so you like cover it in chocolate, and it's like, all right, but it's still eating chocolate. You're doing
Yeah,
it for the ego in a sense, but I don't know
yeah.
if the analogy exactly
I
works.
think I could, because like then they're gonna assume, or what if they want their broccoli covered chocolate, or chocolate covered broccoli now?
All broccoli is going to be associated with chocolate now, so it's
Yeah.
like kind of missing the point of eating broccoli. But this, I've been wanting to read this here. One of his, it seems like one of his first strong declarations about the nature of the unconscious, and he's going to, throughout the rest of the seminars, have many things to say about the unconscious,
Yeah.
and characterize it in a variety of different ways. But he says, you should stand back from the idea that resistance is all of a piece with the notion that the unconscious in a given subject at a given moment contained, and, as one says, repressed. It's down there. You need to
Yeah.
get out, get it. The problem with the unconscious is that it's got this thick layer that needs to be penetrated in order to, and you just can't talk about it in these terms without it getting sounding kind of sexual, but
Yeah, that, or just the fact that it's like there's like this, just there's something within me that I need to let out, like because the unconscious is not something new that's you know privileged to psychoanalysis. Like, it's, even though Freud made it the focus of his theory, the unconscious came from somebody like Edward von Hartmann and the other like German romanticists, and they thought of it like this unconscious creativity, or you think about it like the metaphysical will of Schopenhauer, or the will to power to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche even brought up drives too, like how drives were repressed by the slave morality of Christianity, but like, or this vitalization of the excitation of the body, or of this invigoration and power of expressing the joy of life, or something like that. But like in this case, it's like it's totally different. We're talking about like the unconscious, how it's structured, like in the sense of like a neurotic or psychotic, etc.
in that way, what I love about Lacan's approach to the unconscious is also that he almost trivializes it to the point where it's not this inner vitality that in any sense embellishes your soul
Yeah.
and beautifies creative production. It is creative in a sense. I mean, there is a creative potential in
Oh
its
yeah.
investigation, but it is not in itself some spiritual substratum that is in any sense more glamorous than just the banal facts of conscious existence. And
Yeah,
I
it's
think
not some pantheism, it's not some animism. It's definitely not like a Jungian like archetypes in within that are just like trying to project themselves out in a projective mechanism fashion, because that's what archetypes are, projective mechanisms to him. And the unconscious is like something that you have to go down buried within, like the chthonic underworld of the Greeks, like Odysseus going down into, like what I mentioned to you, the Nekia, the process of going down into the underworld.
that sounds all well and good, and I would love
Yeah.
would love to believe that there are these inner riches within us.
Yeah, like fragments that you have to integrate, because it's a like your ego, even though it's like this mask that you wear, it's like there's fragments of yourself in the unconscious that you'd have to like integrate, and that's the alchemical process. But it's like, yeah, it sounds beautiful, but in a sense, like, and that's the thing, it's like, to what degree does that actually appeal to the phantasmatic position of the ego's mastery, especially now in capitalist discourse? Like, that seems to fit very well and dandy with that fucking astrology hose and freaking like Myers-Briggs stuff and all these other things, like personality charts, personality tests. Oh, you're the caregiver, you're the adventurer, you're the, I don't know, just like it could go on and on from there. Like,
Yeah,
this
but
is who you're meant to be.
you're always typified, or can I say
Yeah.
archetypified, to coin a phrase, by these noble paradigms. And it's just like the same thing of when people try to figure out through clairvoyance or whatever what other lives they've lived. No one's ever just a peasant for some reason. Like chances are, at any point in history, the vast majority of us would have been peasants who died.
Yeah, oh definitely.
Lucky. And the same would be true of, let's say, to my mind, the inner contents, the inner richnesses waiting to be uncovered by more mystical sort of offshoots of the psychoanalytic technique that would, in some sense, you know, it make you. There's always like a enamel of like regality and like royalty, and it's strange because that's also the place of certain ideological formations that inform the very collective fantasy that goes into the archetypes we think are meant to be covered here. And it's like, again, hidden in plain sight, it's on the surface. This is what Zizek's always laboring to emphasize, is that no, it's right there. When you think, okay, so I must be the caregiver at the core of my being, it's like, well, why that? Why that form? Why does it take that appearance?
Oh,
In,
not even just, it's just the fact that it's the core of your being, the fact that you said that, that's like this kernel.
that,
Yeah.
the core of your being. Like, exactly. That's the structure of the fantasy that's informing the very
Yeah.
process that's taking place and what needs to be debunked in a sense.
Yeah. This transcendental consciousness or self that's outside of this, like, you're the phenomenal world, or like the conditions that you're in. Like, I'm not this right now, but I will be this person one day. Like, I can transcend my limitations to, achieve this, my true self. And it doesn't even have to be in terms of that. It could be in the fact, like, my in any identity category, gender category, like in the sense that gender doesn't become performative, but it becomes like an identity category too. Like this is what Zizek talks about, like the flaw of id pull, that like, oh, with the identity politics in its liberal form, neoliberal form, um, undermining like the revolutionary aspect of that LGBTQ, the plus of difference, but the fact it's like it's not no longer that I've entered the plane of difference, but it's the fact it's like I was this gender that didn't feel right, but now I'm in this gender and like I feel like I am my true self. It's just like, well, now you've kind of like usurped that because now you just fell into the contradictions of subjectivity, in fantasy by saying you're this, you weren't who you were, but there was this kernel of truth, this agama that came in, and now that it's fulfilled because you feel like this, and
Right.
yeah, and it goes into any and other aspect too, not just that, but like I think Zizek kind of points that out in the political context of like the climate that we're in.
So this is more of Lacan quoting Freud. He says excessively great pathogenic importance of the element chosen with view to the transference resistance, and then Freud employs a nice little metaphor here about just because something is fiercely guarded in the course of a battle doesn't mean that it contains some really valuable object. So in the case of the transference idea, he says the value of the object may be a purely tactical one, may perhaps emerge only in this one battle. So just because someone may be within the course of the transference mentions something in particular, or their attention centers on some specific image or object, doesn't mean that it's the end all be all of their symbolic universe necessarily. Be an entry.
Definitely not.
Um, I think we should probably speed it up. It's already 9. Wow.
Yeah, I mean it's fine. This is a heavy text or a heavy
Yeah.
chapter.
More German. Look at
More German.
I. God bless anyone who has the patience to learn that language. Just look at the length of those words, the umlauts. Uh, Something emerges which is not the phenomenon of transference itself, but a phenomenon with essential relation to it. Maybe let's skip ahead a little bit unless there's something important you want to point out here.
The dynamic transference.
Transference isn't like this everywhere else, but that there is a quite particular function. So he's linking
Oh,
conscious. Who is speaking?
yeah. And this could be the fact of like what's leading up to like the refusal, the whole Verfung, and that in this particular like transference, the refusal to speak of what's coming up, I guess for lack of a better term, from the surface of uh coming up onto the surface, which is like the full speech of certain complexes from, whether it's the Oedipus, or just in this transference of what's underlying in the unconscious through the resistances, that this process of refusal to speak or this refusal to acknowledge or to affirm it, which happens through the mediation of the ego, which the ego, of course, is resistance. But it's the specific type of resistance, which is a refusal.
Right. Okay. That's a specific type of resistance, which is
Yeah, the unconscious refusal, which is, I mean, obviously we're gonna get into that in the next chapter, like Freud's negation, Verneinung and Verwerfung.
okay. That's chapter 5.
Yeah. but it is brought up in here a little bit because it's like Verwerfung is not equal to Verdrängung, or repression. Refusal and repression are not the same thing. That I think that there is something at the works of the ego level, or the ego's mediation in its resistances that refuses to speak. And I think it happens in these resistances of the silence, or just, yeah, like the not willingness to talk, or in the resistance in the transference to bring about something, but which is different from repression. Because yes, repression is a return of the repressed, it always returns, but sometimes like it isn't acknowledged the plane of the ego. It's still like kind of in the, buried deep in, like, again, like, let's just use that metaphor, buried deep in through the mechanisms of repression or the unconscious. Like it's not in the, like the somatic plane, or the part of the pre-conscious, which you could just remember just from a couple dreams you had, like, oh yeah, or like through, again, when Freud was dealing with hypnosis. Like these are like certain memories of it that are repressed, that take years of work to even actualize themselves or affirm themselves through speech.
But transference is the first step towards that.
Yes, and transferences and resistances are part of the technique. Transference allows for resistance to take place. Transference is just the overall beginning of when analysis takes place in general, and it's that intersubjective relationship, but also like it's not just between two people. Of course, it's like, mediated by a third, speech and language, the law. But with the work of resistances, you get to see the technique take place and see the different, I guess, other parts of resistances, like Verwerfung, the refusal, or like what it was, the deformation of the E, or the deformation of the speech, the empty speech, something
But,
that revelatory.
but disavowal is not refusal, right?
No, disavowal is something else. Disavowal is actually something that takes more precedence in perverse subjects, perversion, because it's more of a disavowal of a perverted fantasy.
So he talks about presence again, and I think this is really beautifully poetically said, how we are all influenced by all sorts of presences, and our world only possesses its consistency, its density, its lived stability, because in some way we take account of these presences, but we do not realize them as such. You can really sense that as a feeling which I'd say we are always trying to efface from life. And I would think that the role the ego is playing is that of trying to efface these presences from life, so we aren't faced with the anxiety caused by being too close to the object,
Yeah.
cause of our desire. But that's not an idea that he has yet, but he does mention desire in a bit.
Yeah. Do you mind if we take a 5-minute break real
Yeah,
quickly?
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Quick restroom break. How far are we in the text?
Let's see. We haven't. We should skip ahead, or at least or table some of this for the next
Yeah.
conversation if you want to. There really is a lot here, but we haven't
I
even
feel
gotten.
like we could probably finish it tonight, because
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
we're beating a lot, like a dead horse. Because I think the most important part is where we get into like the resistance of like not only the empty and full speech stuff, but also the forgetting of names, like Signorelli.
yeah, because we need some examples to kind of like beef up all the concepts that we're talking about, and that's what he's going to
Yeah.
get at. So, yeah, all right, 5 minutes.
Yeah. So it's 9:02 right here. So 9:07.
Yep. Yeah.
All right, good to go.
All right. Let's all right, let's skip ahead then.
Yeah.
This is where Hippolyte says rejection.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about Verfong and Drangon, or Drangdong, however you pronounce it, but repression versus rejection or refusal.
Yeah, and if you're fine with this, we should probably skip.
Mm-hmm. I think we've kind of said like, and I know I elaborated a shit ton on that, like a little.
Great job of that.
Yeah.
I don't know what he means by like genital structure and castration here in infantile sexual theory and how it plays
Yeah.
in.
Well, like the thing is, like with the anal, what I'm kind of like getting towards, like learning about that, is more of like the fact that it's like it's still on the imaginary plane of like the mother kind of attending to their vulnerable needs, especially like, you know, the anal is the obviously where the baby's getting their, you know, ass wiped and stuff like that. And then like the phallic, the genital, is along the lines where Oedipal castration takes place, where the secondary narcissism comes, where the law takes place. It's like, oh, like, and especially with Freud, because, you know, he was literal about these things, and in trying to add like the biological sense. It's like, oh, you want to masturbate? Oh, you can't, because, you know, that's prohibited. So that's like the where, like, you know, oh, finally the act of finding some type of immediate pleasure in that sense gets rejected by the law, the prohibition, and this castration of, at least for Lacan, castration is not a literal castration, but it's symbolic. It's like you're cut off from their sense of satisfaction from mirroring the person who gives you the immediate gratification in taking care of your basic needs.
Right, so you go from a level of polymorphous perversity,
Yeah.
having your body like essentially almost like colonized in a way by language, as Lacan would put it, Oedipalization, prohibition.
Yeah, definitely. And to the point, like, I'm still trying to understand, like, how does the regression towards the anal stage take place, or play a role in? Because I know, like, in certain cases, like there's like a certain regression down to like where certain like behavior patterns from around that age of libido development takes place. I think it's more along the lines of like kind of feeling more vulnerable to the world, or maybe like to the act, like, what's the term when you're anal retentive?
Expression people still use.
Yeah.
It was a little jarring. So they talk about initial nucleus of Lacan's talking about initial nucleus of the repressed, which again we've been circling. We don't need to beat a dead horse any longer. That is sort of the locus of the transference, might lead us to the initial nucleus of the repressed, and then jumping ahead here, he talks about an original traumatic experience. I think he's mentioned trauma before, but this is one of the first times he brings it up.
Yeah. The Wolfman.
And he says we do hang on to the idea that the primitive nucleus is to be found at another level from that of the derivatives of repression. Is this primal repression?
I want to say that, yeah, he is kind of preluding towards a primal repression.
So, what has been?
And I think primal repression is located at the point of the fact of castration, or during the experience. Like, it's either like in relation to the castration with the primary narcissism of the feeling of not only a sense of false mastery, but also like of the imaginary relationship between the baby and the primary caregiver of all its libidinal drives, pure drives or pure instincts, I should say.
So he goes back to the Werfung, and it says strange excluded from the subject's history, and which he is incapable of saying had to be forced out by Freud in order to see the back of it. So those are like almost something similar to the redacted portions of a letter. Is a metaphor that occurred to me where parts of it are blocked out. And that's what we want to uncover here. Elements in this complicated whole, which are in fact simultaneously. Okay, this is where it really gets interesting. Now it starts to heat up. He says, elements in this complicated whole, which are in fact simultaneous, can only be represented successively in my description of them. So that describes the logic of a dream in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, he did bring up the interpretation of dreams earlier that he's mentioned in German, Traumatung or whatever how you pronounce it, Traumatitung. Well, no, yeah, that's how I interpreted too.
So he's going to ask, what is the dream, and is the subject's reconstitution of it accurate? What's interesting is that, according to Lacan, Freud doesn't feel like an exact account of the events of the dream is what is fundamental here in this process, but rather the whatever scrap remains, whether it's accurate or not, whether it corresponds to the dream itself as it was experienced, or rather how it relates to the phantasmatic constitution of the subject. Correct me if I'm missing.
No, yeah, and I think like this is like also kind of the same thing with Jung as well. He kind of does the same thing, except he's not dealing with dream interpretation. Well, he is, but he's more focused on dream symbols. And I think maybe he kind of gets with that, like he gets too lost in like you could say his own fetishism of the dream, in which like there are like some kernels of truth that he could find. But be that as it may, it still doesn't really have to pertain to something accurate, so long like to real life or the subject's history, so long as like there could be some underlying like meaning that like corresponds to the subject's or the subject in question, their agreement. But like I think that like from the way you interpret it definitely aligns to what's going on, and even how like studying this and then kind of reflecting back on my personal experience with analysis kind of seems to correspond.
Yeah, and my personal experience with just trying to remember dreams is I only am ever able to recover some debris, certain little. I'm not good at. I'll have really long, complex, convoluted dreams, and I'm only able to remember little bits and pieces. But Lacan's saying that's okay, and in fact, maybe it's preferable, because he goes as far as to say the most significant dream would be the dream that has been completely forgotten. And the more uncertain the text that the subject gives us, the more it's meaningful, because in those gaps would our own fantasy formations populate those gaps in a sense.
Yeah.
But it all, and here's the key word, talks about dream thoughts, or as you just mentioned, Traumdeutung, which is has to do with trauma, though, right?
No, that's the German, I guess, way of saying the interpretation of dreams.
Right. It says it there. Yeah. The dream thoughts, dream work, I think.
Yeah.
Is another way it's referred to. And it says these aren't what we usually call thoughts, since what is always involved is a desire.
Well,
So,
yeah, and that's how he would say his desire, but like Freud is like the unconscious wish or like the unfulfilled wish.
right, so he's twisting it a little bit. And whenever you desire, you can kind of put down your bingo marker
Yeah.
on that. It's going to be important. And as of now, at this point, I'm not sure that I mean, desire is going to take on take many twists and turns from this point on in his theory. But he says, and whose desire anyway? From what lack? And of course, when we talk about desire, we're talking about lack, so it makes sense that he would ask those two questions together. So he's talking about this interesting incident from a little note from introductory lectures. Freud had a woman patient, both skeptical and interested in him, and she read his book on wits. I guess is about jokes, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that also is on the jokes in the relationship to the unconscious.
What's interesting about this is that we were talking about this a little bit earlier in the context of the Wolfman, who had read one of his essays, and how, to what extent exposure to the metapsychology behind the techniques being used in some sense influences the patient's transference. Yeah. They relate to the analyst. This is a really interesting case.
Yeah, and I think like it's more relevant now just to the fact that like look at how diverse information is. Everybody knows about Freud and Jung, but they don't really know about Freud and Jung, if that makes sense. Like everybody knows about the id, super ego. Everybody could talk about like, yeah, the shadow or the self or the archetypes. Like they're so familiar with these terms, but they don't really know what that implies, or they don't know the distinction between the clinical work and the metapsychology. And at the same time, they feel like they have like, not in a sense the subject's supposed to know, but subject like this false sense of mastery though, like that they have some upper hand compared to everybody else. But really, when they come to analysis, like they don't feel like they're duped, but at the same time, like they feel like they have the edge, and then they realize like, oh, I don't really know anything because they don't know what's going on, like because of, and again, like this is like a small example, but it's like I feel like this has more relevance now than ever because of how vast like the publication of these works are. Everybody has access to them, but yet nobody's actually, like, not to toot our own horns, but nobody's actually trying to understand the technique. They're not trying to understand resistance and stuff like that. They just read, I don't know, like maybe interpretation of dreams, or they read like ego and the id, totem and taboo. They read all of Jung's like the Red Book, or Man in Search of His Soul. But what does that have to do with technique? That's just all metapsychology.
Right. And
with the exception of the interpretation of dreams, but do they know what technique is being implied there?
They equate the application of the technique with the knowledge, in scare quotes, that they've acquired from reading, breezing through the ego and the id, other texts. So the scrap that surfaces from this dream is the word channel, and that's pretty much all she remembers from the dream, other than the fact that his book figures into it and the praise that the other people in the dream give to the book. And he says, this scrap is surrounded by an aura of uncertainty. Why this word channel? So the next day she relates another anecdote. This isn't a dream, but a joke that she had heard from someone, and the word channel figures into that too. an Englishman and a Frenchman are talking, and the Frenchman quotes the well-known dictum. I won't try to say this in French, but I know it means between the sublime and the ridiculous, there is only a step. And the Frenchman gallantly replies, "Oui, le pas de Calais." Pretty, I think I said that right. And that's the channel of Calais, which is, or the step of Calais is the channel, not the channel of Calais, is the channel of La Manche, the English channel. So again, this word channel, what the hell's going on? So we have the emergent presence in the moment of resistance. So she had talked about the merits of Freud's theory of jokes, right? Skeptical, but is interested in his theory of jokes. So he says that, Lacan says that this joke specifically is callback to channel. The point by which the dream hangs on the listener is meant for Freud. So in a sense, her use of this joke, of tying it in, how I read this was that, one, it's an example of transference emerging at the, as he just says, with the advent of the presence, the registration of the presence of the analyst. But also I feel like it's an attempt to ingratiate herself with Freud. Like, is she trying to flatter him in a sense by coming up with, or by being willfully, like, just like we were talking about, being Freudian with her example for Freud in a sense?
Yeah, and that's actually pretty good thing to point out, because she is skeptical, but yet she is like kind of, in a sense, giving him a compliment on the thing of jokes, which is pretty interesting that now they bring it up, because I mean, I think he knew about the transference, but it's like he didn't counter transference right here, but yet counter transference wasn't really known about until the Dora incident. So it's like, I think that's pretty interesting too, because it also shows like how far Freud, like, not to get off topic, but how Freud, like, how far in his mission he was to like crack the case in his, inquiring in psychoanalysis being a science, or whatever his mission was, which I think it was that, trying to make it a science, trying to be a scientist. But I would say, yeah, that was like, in a sense, not like just necessarily just transference, but also like, well, I'm trying to think the type of transferences, because there is the neurotic one, transference neuroses, and then there's like erotic and then eroticized. But insofar as she's just giving him a compliment, I don't know at what level the transference is, if you see what I'm trying to build up to. So like, if she was skeptical of it, like, why was she so like insistent on going in analysis, besides the fact that there is this joke, or this like this like, I guess, compliment, and also like some sort of like inquiry into like his theory of jokes.
Well, I wonder if there's anything that, but I don't know if this is transference, but I wonder if it has anything to do with her attempt to subvert his position as subject supposed to know by pretty much implying that I understand how your technique works, and this is what we were just talking.
Yeah, that too, yeah.
And I'm going to get ahead of you by drawing my own connection here. And but there might be more to it. I would like to read exactly what.
No, actually, yeah, that's definitely like, and I don't think she was the first, because I think it was one of the the two dudes. It was either the rat or the or the wolf man. One of them. I want to say it was the rat man that was trying to do that with Freud because he had read a couple of his texts and was trying to like undermine him. Yeah, I don't think it was the wolf. I think it was the rat
Right.
man. Yeah, the same thing, and just like this, like, oh, I read a couple of your texts, so and mentioned that, so I'm gonna try to undermine. Like, I know what your technique is. Like, there's this flaw. You're not really, this person you think you are, and in a sense, like trying to attack one's character as a form of resistance within the transference.
I read it also like she's saying, "Oh my gosh, you're so clever for coming up with this technique." She's
Yeah,
like you said, it's like, well, this technique is clever, but I can manipulate it. My
yeah. It's like the contradiction of the resistance is it relies on both a compliment and a hate, like the love and hate at the same time. Like that's like the cliche saying, there's a thin line between love and hate.
right.
But in the transference, it's like this dual emotion, like this envy and aversion, or this envy and like this like wish to have mastery over, which kind of shows more like along the lines of what Lacan is working with. It's like we get into like, oh shit, it's like we get into this Kojevian Hegelian aspect of master slave dialectic.
Hmm.
Yeah, like of like like, and that's what I was talking about, like the level of aggressivity in the imaginary aspect of the transference is like, oh, you're in this position, and the way it's mirroring on me, it's like I feel lesser than you, but I feel like I should be in your position, not you. So I will take that from you in some sort of way, or at least deem it down to make myself feel higher.
So okay, and this is why it's sort of a very pregnant sort of moment because initially, as you have mentioned many times, you should be duped into believing that this analyst knows something about you that you don't, holds the
Yeah,
key to some sort of special knowledge that together you're going to unlock. And then I don't know if we should separate the process into phases or stages, but it seems like
yeah,
resistance makes itself felt in the guise of transference when it's like, oh, I've seen through you, you don't know
yeah,
anything at all. Then something like resistance emerges, that imaginary dyadic relationship of love, hate, and in this case, it manifests itself
no,
through.
no, definitely, yeah, because it's like maybe they don't get duped. Maybe like this analyst is also like not just private, but also works through the state or the county, or like is a social worker or a counselor of some sort, and somebody's there on legal purposes, right? They get court ordered, and they somehow like are just like, okay, I don't want to do this, but oh, you do analysis or something. Like, this is a hypothetical scenario, or like, the family put them in there and they didn't want to, but the family like literally like begged them to go, and they just don't feel duped, and they're just skeptical. They're just trying to read this analyst, like, and it's like the same, like, what can somebody tell me about my life that I don't already know? And so instead of them actually trying to talk about the fantasies, they're just trying to resist, they're trying to stay silent, or they're engaging in some type of conversation that provokes the analyst to speak and to make certain statements so that they could try to dupe them, or read through them. And in this case, you see this person trying to, in a sense, undermine Freud by complimenting them on their work, but at the same time, like trying to topple them and take over the throne of mastery.
Great. So in this case,
And
what's
that's valid because they're not trying to say that psychoanalysis is false. It's like, oh, I could do it better than you. It's like that's where the pleasure comes into that.
they could be saying both
Yeah.
false, and I can also do it better than you because, well, I've cracked the code of the technique essentially.
Yeah.
The transference also comes into play in as much as her tactic reveals something about her unconscious in a sense. The tactic that she's employing here with the joke or with this approach essentially says something about her as a subject. But now we get the next part. This is my favorite part so far in the seminar.
It's a fucking banger.
This is a banger. This is when it gets like really wild. You know, Signorelli saw his painting earlier. This is it, just for reference.
Yeah.
Where's the Antichrist? Oh, I guess this is him.
Yeah, right behind. Is it right there? Yeah.
Yeah,
You see right there, you see the devil like hugging Jesus in the podium, it looks like.
wait, so who's the Antichrist then?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. Like, who's who?
Whoever
Because
looks,
those look like that looks like an archangel, and is that like a fallen somebody? Like, I have no clue.
who looks the most like Tim Pool? The Antichrist.
I don't see anybody with the beanie on. So.
Yeah, this guy's got a beanie. Well, nah.
Who's Joe Rogan in this shit then?
Who's the broadest, most gorilla-like person?
He's on TRT.
Who looks like TRT?
Yeah.
So he's talking about like the grouping of facts and what he said before about like facts being simultaneous but needing to be arranged in a certain succession. And I just want to remind us of when we talk about like socialized time and refer back to the chapter before where he sees the face in the curtains of the marquee. I feel like there's similar but a lot more elaborate and embroidered going on here. So Freud talks about in the psychopathology of everyday life trying to bring to mind the name of the author of the celebrated fresco we just saw, Signorelli, and he can't recover the name. So some of the way Lacan recounts this, it's a little bit confusing, but basically, like Freud is going down this path just as an attempt to remember this name. Like, is that right?
Yeah, he's like free associating, and he realizes that like it's what happened is like he's forgetting the name because of the fact of like in some instances it's like a patient of his who was just like super sexually fixated and believed that a life without sexual potency would be like a life not worth living, like no sex drive, whatever. It's like, if I can't smash, I'd rather die. And then like I don't know if it's the same patient or a different patient. I think it's the same one where like
it gets confusing, like who the subject of these interactions are at a certain point, but these are conversations that he's had. So what's fascinating is that he is connecting signifiers to memories back to signifiers.
And just before we continue on, that's a great way to think about it, because you're saying memories, connecting signifiers to memories. In the clinical introduction to Freud by Bruce Fink, he invites us to think of like Freud's schema of memory as M1, then you have like the slash, and then you have the other memory, which is more unconscious, which hypnotism couldn't get through because of the resistances. But we could take signification in that same route as M1 being the same one as S1, or well, I think S1 would be more unconscious, but you get the point. Like these signifiers being the same as like memory, like the more unconscious you go, the more primordial they get.
Is that
signification? So we should think of memory and signifiers the same thing because there's a linguistic structure to them.
I saw in your story you're reading his clinical introduction to Freud.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really simplified, really easy to read.
But that's where the M1 M2 thing is from.
Yeah, that's what Bruce Fink was telling us about, like as far as like how Freud's like old schema of memory is, and like it's like what he was grappling with when he was trying to mess with hypnosis, dream work, and then finally the talking cure, which of course is brought up in the commentary.
Right. So We don't have to go through the entire itinerary
Yeah,
of his remembrances here, but like,
but that's what he seems like he's doing though. Like he's trying to do the memory association with words, and it's like he finally remembers.
like a beautiful mind or something is how I picture this. You know, and he's like seeing. Have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe? He plays a
What's
math.
up?
Have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe?
No, 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 no. I know Russell Crowe, but no, I've never seen that.
Oh, well, have you ever seen like Minority Report?
I have, yeah.
When he's like swiping the screens that like these virtual screens, it's
Yeah.
like picturing, but it's like Bosnia, Herzegovina, hair, that Muslim guy I talked to, that like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like pretty bad. He's like, I want to know this name. All right, let's see if my technique works. And he could have made all this shit up, so I don't know.
That's funny as fuck.
That's the other guy, but so I don't know which details are worth highlighting here, but yeah, like you said, something like Muslim clientele, death is a part of it.
Yeah, because of family members, and then like sexual potency.
Sexual potency, their attention to all matter of tiny details when it comes to everything having to do with sex and
Yeah. It's
pretty
like
here. The important thing is that he remembers the name Signorelli. The key connection being with hair, which is really interesting. Herzegovina, hair, Sir, Mr., Signorelli, Signore. And what's fascinating is this meaningful forgetting, this idea of meaningful forgetting, which is a.
and I think that's what ties in with the refusal or
So
the
when we talk about that, I want to just point out that we're everyone is really fixated on slips, of course, Freudian slip as like the most important of all the parapraxes. But I feel like this is one that gets neglected. Is that forgetting, meaningful forgetting, is also is it a parapraxis? Is that what's called?
yeah, it's part of the parapraxises, and he goes over that in the introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Like there's like I think 4 lectures on parapraxis, if not 3. Yeah.
Right, like it's a often neglected parapraxis, but it's also very indicative of well, something repressed, something
Yeah.
refused. You could, but you were about to talk about refusal.
Yeah. Refusal, rejection. Verwerfung, and then we'll get into the next chapter, Verneinung, denegation. The only German 101 I know.
No, you had me convinced.
Yeah. What's up?
You had me convinced with the pronunciation. I just go off of what I hear, like really bad impression. Imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger saying it.
Yeah. Get in the chopper now. Kill me now.
It's like
The freaking Arnold Schwarzenegger meme. It's like, hold up, Lacan, I'm here to attend your lecture.
I haven't seen that one.
No, the one that I made, it's like that iconic one that they have. It's like him wearing the beanie and he's like running, he's jogging, he's like all ripped.
You put him in the optical schema.
Yeah.
So yeah, after a certain number of root elements have been recalled by what he calls the repressed, that is to say, ideas concerning the sexual stories of the Muslims and the theme of death. I feel like you can go wrong reading this because it's so packed with associations that you're like, wait, what's of importance here? What should I be focused on? Death? Should I be focused on sex? Should I be focused on Muslims? Like,
we should focus on it all, how it ties in together to focus on Freud's forgetting. But it's like, I was confused. It's like, why was he forgetful in the first place? Did this certain patient kind of weird him out that he had, like, where it was kind of like, I guess, like he needed to unconsciously forget it. It was a meaningful forgetting for him. Like, and this just shows like how early in his work was it, because obviously like there is this like emotional thing in analysis. It's like you're dealing with some deep stuff, like, and it's like another thing that comes with the transference, which we should have brought up when it comes to resistances and transference idea, which is like the fact that and I got this from the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, because they post really good short video lectures, but like they're really good when they talk about like somehow the patients will have a transference because the fact that's like, oh, their specific analyst always takes like 3 months, no, not 3 months, like 3 weeks of vacation, every specific year, but somehow like, they took three like those 3 weeks of vacation right when they got this new patient, and it transfers. It's like, oh, why did they have to take 3 weeks? Like, was it because I told them about the specific like thing like 2 days before? It's just like, oh, did I weird them out, or are they using that vacation as an excuse, like, or just to say that, oh, I'm gonna go on vacation, but really I just don't want to see you anymore, like some things like that. But like, it's like some things like that um like obviously some analysts do take that much time off, and maybe like this is like kind of part of the whole transference process, and the fact that Freud was dealing with some certain themes like this, of like this over detailed about sexuality and stuff, and this whole process of death that he wasn't used to. Not to say that he took vacation because of, but it's the fact it's like this is kind of a precursor to like what you see future analysts handling their way of coping with dealing with this much emotion that they have to process from other people. And because he is the father of psychoanalysis, maybe he didn't have a way to express this, even though he was on vacation. It's like he didn't put the two to two together. Like, he's still like processing, like, how does an analyst handle all this amount of fucking emotion that they're constantly getting thrown on, data dumped on them. Instead of him processing it and dealing with it, he just fucking repressed it down.
Yeah, because this poor guy, the father of psychoanalysis, does not in turn have
an analyst.
Yeah, or anyone who can do it as good as he can. It's lonely at the top, I guess.
Yeah, freaking guru. It's only at the top.
Exactly. So, but my question is the forgetting only meaningful if it is taken to be meaningful?
Yeah, and that's the other question too. It's like, if it does become meaningful for the analyzand as far as they have that process of remembering, yes, because there's that element of remembering.
He could have just and like I don't care. I don't remember. There's plenty of remember something, we don't bother to try to recall it. Or
yeah, and it's like the subject can, or like the ego, or like the patient can lie, but at one point does a lie just become like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, so like, why would you say that? That doesn't make sense. Like, or like, I don't remember such a thing like that. Or like, again, the certain cues with the body language, or just the playing with words, like playing with signifiers, and the fact that these are being played with. And so it's like, even though the subject could lie, it may all crumble down later.
Another thing,
they will force themselves to tell the truth, because of like, in the fact it's like, yeah, they lied, but it's like, now we're dealing with transference, and if it's an Oedipal transference, it's like, how well did they do with lying to their father or their mother? And then like the fact that the symbolic transference happens to where it's like the analyst acts like my mother or acts like my father in this way. It's like, I feel so guilty for lying to you. I feel shameful. I feel wrong. I feel
Right.
ugly and disgusted at myself. You're the one who's helping me, you know, and I lied to you. Like, how could you want me as a client? Like,
Right. So then the line can be productive, but aim
yeah,
to get that analyzan to be as consciously honest as
yeah,
because even then, I feel like built into the imperative to be an honest person is a kind of value judgment that would once again attach you to a prevailing ideology.
yeah.
And it's supposed to be a non-ideological process in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have to bring ideology into it yet because
Yeah.
that's a
Although
very
I think that the whole thing of convict sod gets brought up into here on this in this entire seminar, which talks about the imperative, like the categorical imperative, like of Kant, and then like the whole rebellion, voyeurism, sadism, and like, you know, perversion of Sade, or whatever his name is, Sade, Marquis de Sade, which is it's just it's kind of funny that you brought that kind of correlation in, because I think that does get talked about in the end of seminar one, and I think there is an Acree essay on that, or essay that's published in the Acree that's somewhere earlier.
yeah. I need to read function and field and then that for sure.
Yeah, function and field is really good. Like, it really helped me understand a lot of the whole language aspect of it.
I'm going to try to read that this week because I know that this is a clarification of that. So, but what I really love about this example is how exactly what I was saying before. It's like you have all these simultaneous elements that are of different orders of memory and thinking
Yeah,
that have to be organized in a succession, but in any other form of discourse, in any other sphere of thinking, you're not allowed to arrange elements like these
yeah,
side by side because it would just be seen as nonsensical. Whereas in psychoanalysis, it's the
yeah.
fundamental rule. It's
And I like I want to use the word again, and this is what OG Rose Daniel Garner was saying about higher order causality. It's like psychoanalysis is like kind of like keen at doing this higher order causality with stuff like this, and you're talking about like all these associations. And think of like a libido associating all these like associations, or like all these memories into like this conglomeration of things. It's like those laser pointers, like going into the house of mirrors and just shooting a laser pointer at one mirror, and there's all of a sudden it's just like everywhere. That's an association right there. Like, that's how association happens.
yeah, I don't know if I'm using higher order in the technical sense when I say
Yeah,
that.
but you brought that up earlier, and it made me think of that. Like, that's how we should think of like higher order, not like lower order causality, where it's like A necessarily causes B, where B necessarily causes C. You know,
But it's exactly now the laser pointer example there is beautiful
yeah,
because it's bouncing chaotically from one to
yeah,
another, from one surface to another. Also, because this is going to sound weird, but it also kind of doesn't know what it is when it's dealing with reflective surface.
yeah.
So that's kind of like the subject almost, I would say. So, all right, we should probably wrap this up because it's 10 and your caffeine stamina might be waning at this point.
A little bit, yeah.
Done an incredible job of keeping up.
Oh
Should,
yeah, 18 miles of bike riding.
yeah, I was gonna say if there's ever gonna be any listeners for this, which there will be,
Yeah,
bear in mind that Andrew is engaging in this very higher order type conversation after having
yeah,
like 18 miles.
yeah. Of riding my bike, and then not to mention that tomorrow I'll do the same thing, but I'm gonna try to do an hour of weightlifting.
As he mentioned before, this is his form of jouissance.
Yeah, just destroying my body. I gotta add yoga into that, and that's why I'm constantly moving back and forth, because I don't like to lounge on my couch like this for too long, because it just rolls my shoulders and I'm just like, ugh. So I gotta sit up straight. But it's also good because, especially when you're getting into those good moments, I'm like, Oh yeah, let's get into this.
All right, so I'm gonna step my game up to
Yeah.
get out of here.
Yeah, posture is just like
So,
important to me.
all right,
That's my neuroses. I'm like, is my posture good? Oh, fuck.
few more epiphanies here, and then we'll fix your posture via.
Yeah.
So, what the head, Signorelli? That's my question for you. No, he says it is inasmuch as speech, that speech which might reveal the deepest secret of Freud's being, isn't spoken, that all Freud can do is hang on to the other with the scraps of this speech.
Mhm. These scraps, because they were brought up in the dreams too.
Again, we're dealing with scraps, the phenomenon of forgetting literally made manifest by the degradation of speech in its relation to the other. So the other in this case, because I forget it's hard to follow. Like, who is he talking to on the train?
It's one of his like travel colleagues. That's all I know. It's like it's somebody who was like his travel friend, and that's why like he was trying to like bring up the name of Signorelli, but somehow like he forgot, and then like I think in his own, I don't know if it was like right then and there or like later on in the day, like when he was by himself, he started to go into like some type of association. That's where I'm kind of confused about. It's like this motherfucker's just freestyling on the spot. All right, let me associate real quick.
I'm just wondering. Well, the other in this case, I mean, in all of the examples we've been working with up until this
Yeah,
point, the other would be the analyst. In this case, there's not actually an analyst.
yeah. Freud is his own analyst at this point.
Own other. So
Yeah, he's taking one for the team.
confession of being doesn't come to term that speech runs entirely along the slope by which it hooks on to the other. So, well, the thing that, like, the moment that seems repressed, or again, I don't know exactly how to use all of these terms, but denied, rejected is at one point he doesn't want to pursue a conversation about death so as not to disturb his interlocutor. So
Yeah.
the idea would be if he continued down this path past Signorelli in a sense, where Signorelli, like the search for the name structured the itinerary that we were talking about,
The
but
pathway.
it's the name itself doesn't matter all that much. Once it's uncovered, it's not like, okay, so that's a quilting point, right? The name,
Yeah.
it's quilted by the name, but it's like there's more. The quilting point's always kind of an anticlimax in a sense because there's more there essentially.
Yeah, there's definitely a split like what's points. We'll stop for now.
We'll end it with Signorelli, and it's funny because it shows like how arbitrary and abrupt the quilting point is.
Yeah.
And just to tie it back to ideology a little bit, it's like these quilting points as they appear to like bookend our experiences, they could be the most arbitrary thing in the world, but once they become socially sanctioned, we just experience that. It's like, oh yeah, right, that's how a Disney movie ends. That's how I mean, infinite examples. Like that's how politicians speak. That's you're supposed to eat lunch at that time. Like anything that happens that like quilts our existence is
It's just creating
ultimately.
appropriate times to like just like, oh, okay.
But
That
speaking,
makes sense.
that's the other thing I wanted to draw back to is he only uses this phrase once, so he's only used it once so far. But this idea of socialized time, where it's like we have also a dissolution of regular temporal coordinates that we have a non-linearity here that is going
Yeah.
through this whole process of association, which is another just really fascinating aspect of.
Yeah, and I think that's also the thing too that's like kind of revolutionary about him is like when he looks at like signification and signifiers, he's not looking at this in this like linear binary structure of like, signifier and signified purely, but rather how like it creates this whole like network that's like a grid, rather than just like this like line, like this like
Right.
arrow of time type thing. Like there is this arrow of time related to what he calls like the synchronic and diachronic, but it doesn't work just like in a linear fashion, but it like kind of like, I guess, it's cyclical, it spirals or whatever, or
Right.
just in this network,
Vertical, horizontal, and
Yeah.
economy and metaphor have to do with that. And remember, he's still trying to figure out, all right, where is the subject in all of this? And we haven't gotten there, but he's defining speech. And I think at this point we've done a really great job of.
Yeah, especially right here, it brings up function and fields.
But just to cap it off, of course, he's going to call these deformations of that characterize the unconscious, that typify the unconscious, what things that are not expressed in the silence, in the breaking off of discourse, as moments of revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what full speech is supposed to render. And the opposite of revelation is speech functioning as mediation.
Exactly. Mediation between the two subjects, or just mediating between itself and the unconscious. And again, unconscious full speech is revelatory. It's revealing something.
Right. And the point is knowing at what level this other is realized and how and which function, which circle of its subjectivity, at what distance this other is. And I think that's where the distance is an interesting word there. And I think it has to do with sort of resistance and transference. And it's a sort of like defining a specific distance between you and the other. And that your approach to the other has to do with setting that distance at a place that makes you feel comfortable, that like is comfortable for your ego, essentially.
Yeah. And when we're talking about, again, like because you mentioned the split of ego and unconscious, like we should look at this empty and full as dialectical. It's like it's not only as like the full speech is revealing something, but it's revealing through error.
Right.
Yeah. It's because it's like dependency of like, because of the split of like ego not being this whole identity and unconscious not being this whole thing. It's not like you have a thesis and antithesis. It's rather just like the affirmation, negation, and negation of the negation.
There's like kind of asymmetry there.
Yeah, it's very asymmetrical.
This right here is just like a diss track, basically. Again, he's just shitting all over Piaget here.
On album.
It's pretty funny, but I'm sure Piaget was a nice guy. So
he actually does draw upon a lot of Piaget, which is crazy though.
Yeah.
Like, Piaget was an experimental psychologist, though. That's the thing. He wasn't an analyst, but like he was dealing with some type of structuralist, not like linguistics, but like trying to do like a structuralist psychology. But again, like still like, at what point like does he like I think he is trying to like structure like ego as a thing though, like this developed teleology from certain elements.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Jordan Peterson's a big Piaget fan. Oh, and that's the thing too. Piaget was focusing on epistemology, like in the most like analytical and continental sense of philosophy, like this actual knowledge. Like these subjects are aiming at exploring knowledge and trying to know the world and gain some like actual like positive knowledge of it. That's what like us subjects want to do. But I mean, not that he uses the term subjects, but like conscious beings want to have full knowledge of the object of our observation, meaning the world.
Right. So it's a very empirical approach.
Yeah, and very like empiricist, like in the sense like we want to control the world through our grasping and all that and the third.
Right. And what of course is like conveniently ignored in that approach is the very intervention that influences the object of inquiry. And that's very very conveniently ignored, I would say.
Yeah, it doesn't it cloaks the fact of fantasy and the fact that this object being grasped is not the actual object, but the object is a phantasmatic object that hides the fact that there's nothing there.
Which is when you're able to organize things into developmental stages, then it's much more easy to discreetly deal with all of the moving parts there.
Yeah.
This is a little bit more challenging, but we can wrap this up. But let me know if there's anything you spot here that's you think might be worth emphasizing.
I think what we're slowly getting at is like now he's wanting to really elaborate on the function and field, which I mean that, and then we already went over refusal, rejection, which I think you really get into a lot of this in detail in the commentary on Verneinum, which I mean you have the actual commentary, which I don't know, you're reading the PDF, but like in the actual like physical copy, it's on the appendix. But like then there's the commentary after, which Lacan gives to congratulate Hippolyte. And then there's actually 2 commentaries in the Acree, which is pretty interesting, which I was trying to read through today. But yeah, like all this will pretty much get more elaborated. So I think we would be beating over a dead horse trying to like go too much into it. Because this is what it's building up to, and that's why he's talking about like the function field and interpreting resistances.
I did want to just quote this before we finish up because I think it's interesting. He says, the more intimate the discourse is for the subject, the more I focus on this discourse. But the inverse is equally true. The emptier his discourse is, the more I too am led to catch hold of the other. That is to say, led into doing what one does all the time, which is led into seeking out the beyond of his discourse. And then he says, made up of my own projection. So he's talking about countertransference there, right?
Yeah, and that's like the thing. It's like that one that again, like that dude that I sent you on YouTube, the old man. He said the same thing. It's like where the point of analysis is it starts with the transference and of course the resistances. And the analyst needs something to bite on, to grasp on, otherwise they can't do their technique. And if you're just talking on, if you're just like narcissistically in your own world, it's like the analyst gets bored, has nothing to work on, and there's the chance that it might counter transference because of the fact it's like it gets in this fantasy of hopefully achieving something or this kernel truth within you. It's like now you become not like subject the analyst doesn't become like in a sense subject supposed to know, but a subject supposed to be known. Like there's this kernel of truth for me to grab hold of, for me to be knowledgeable, like this imperialism, like of me grabbing hold of this object of discovery within you, but you won't let me have it because you keep going on in these tangents that don't allow me to grab hold of because you're not transferring. You're getting so lost into empty speech and Das Mann idle chatter. And I use that because there's this like, we should take seminar 1 as like Lacan grappling with this phenomenology from Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and Heidegger, mainly Heidegger with his empty idle chatter of Das Mann. Getting too immersed in Das Mann that there's nothing to really grasp at the core of one's being, of one's Dasein being in the world.
But I really like what you said about the inverse of the subject supposed to know is the subject supposed to be known.
Yeah.
Which is a false.
Yeah, it's like that's the part of the analyst like fantasizing about the analyst. It's like, okay, like when are they gonna start speaking? Like I want to get to know more about them. I want to like, like it's just like, and that's just because of the fact it's like, okay, they're not like as engaged in knowing like, okay, like maybe this analyst or analyst doesn't really like, they have no knowledge of like what to do because maybe they're just awkward about analysis in general. Like as anyone should be, like they're in therapy for the first time, they're vulnerable, they're telling everybody like this random person that they don't know about their lives. But then there is this, in the sense, like in some sense, a narcissistic person that just doesn't transfer or has a hard time transferring. Now, and some analysts said, like psychoanalysts said, that there is a transference in the narcissism, but it does take time, or it takes a certain technique for that to happen. But in the case of Freud, and what, I guess, thanks to the revolution of Jacques Lacan, is showing, like, people like the narcissists or like the psychotics, they have a transference. It just takes a certain technique, a certain listening.
I guess we'll find out more about that
Yeah.
later. So at the very end of the seminar here, it says, why does the subject alienate himself all the more? He affirms himself as ego, and we come back to last session's question: who then is it who beyond the ego seeks recognition? So we haven't answered this yet.
Yeah.
This is
the subject.
This is the discursive inching towards the answer to that question, but he had to clear some things up first. And we're almost through the first part. There's another chapter here, but as I expected, just that chapter alone.
Yeah.
Wild.
Very beefy.
So I guess at this point, we're kind of done with, not done with, but like we figured out more or less what resistance and transference are. And I predict we'll talk more about the unconscious. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, you're going to get more into like the imaginary and stuff like that, the build up to the symbolic more, but definitely we've kind of covered how to define, how to see it function, like the transference, resistance, its relationship, the modes it takes in the setting. So, like, yeah, it's a lot. But that's the driving, like, not only are like to understand the concepts in this work in general, but this is what drives analysts to do their job, is the transference and the path of resistance. We shouldn't avoid resistance. We shouldn't try to overcome it. We should just kind of like Spartan kick through it and just see like where it takes us.
I have to watch the longer lecture you sent on transference now.
That dude is actually really informative, and like, but like, here's the thing about him. It's like, if I watched a lot of his videos over this weekend, it's like he's one of those dudes, and he's kind of like a Richard Wolff and of Jordan Peterson, in which, like, if you watch a lot of their videos, you'll see that they kind of repeat the same shit over and over again. And it's like, I'm wary of dudes that do that. It's like, what's up with these like boomers that like to like repeat a lot of the same phrases and shit over and over again? It's like, I'm like, okay. And maybe just because of like Jordan Peterson, but they'll repeat a lot of the same like quirky things or like phrases over again. And this dude is kind of a boomer though. Like, he is kind of boomerish, like, where like he's just like, well, I think Oedipus is just like universal. It's like, has this motherfucker ever read Anti-Oedipus before?
I think that isn't that because like a lot of, and I hate to characterize the whole generation this way, but there's like it is a generational trait that I've noticed, which believes that like there can be a closed system and that closure is possible, and that you can reach the height of truth, and it's been said, and
yeah,
we're the one that said it. And I think that like even for I don't know, people that are more about the life of inquiry, there's still, to a certain degree, it's just embedded in kind of generational attitude, which is maybe an endless flux of information all the time, which throws into question everything you say all the time, and it's just like this endless trying to keep up with something that's impossible to attain. But that to me is more inspiring than it's like, all right, we can cap it off here.
Okay.
Emphasis on cap.
Yeah.